So, this is a difficult topic. This is a topic that can make people uneasy for different reasons, so I'm going to handle it with proper gracious care. But I have to be clear. So, um, I want to talk about, I guess, teach about violence and the law and stuff. Now, violence has different definitions depending on occupation and process and stuff. Um, just from a linguistic perspective. But when I'm putting it in light of the law, I'm talking about like the interactive association and relationship and stuff. Um, for the most part, the law doesn't actually support violence and stuff, and I think that's a rational consequence of it being such an ancient thing, even though it's a persisting real possibility in so many places around the country and stuff. Um, and um, there's for one, I think one example I want to talk about is the topic of administrative violence and stuff. And war can be seen as a type of administrative violence, but war is, and I think many people would agree with me, um, inevitable and stuff. I mean, in the politics of memory and stuff, and in the educational systems and stuff, it's a recurring theme in history. So history can be seen as, um, very violent and stuff. But if you subscribe more to the Marxist perspective of class struggle and conflict, it gets more violent. Um, and then, uh, but it's you know it, it it led me to think like what is in principle, like what is the merit in a violent psychology, like a person having a violent mind and psychology and stuff. Um, and I mean, and it's tough to talk about this because so many areas of our culture are violent in a certain sense. Like, you know, there's people that love to shoot guns and stuff, shoot bow, throw spear, um, but they don't necessarily like hurting anybody and stuff. They don't think about it. Um, and for many people, it's a way of life and survival because of what the economy has done to hundreds, thousands of municipalities across the country. And and because of things like conservational hunting and stuff, which is an old practice, but it it it's there. It achieves the results and stuff. But that's a different controversial topic that doesn't really need to be it. We I don't really need to distract into it and stuff. But like it's it's not good for like in a wider picture, it's not good for a person to have a violent psychology and stuff because a person, you know, um, there's going to be times where you need to force the issue and stuff, but and that's not necessarily violent. You know, it regardless of whether you want to consider forcing the issue as something that comes from violence or violence is something that forces the issue and stuff. It's um, you're still going to have to take action, and there's a certain extent, frequency, a certain course and stuff. As situations get um, more complicated and stuff, you um, you know an act of violence or a violent idea and stuff is probably going to uh, create a spark in a powder keg scenario and stuff. And going back to the topic of law, there's in some states and stuff, it is legal for people to consent to fight to settle their differences and stuff. And in some cultures, in some organizations, this is um, much more so normalized than others and stuff. It kind of serves a function of decompression and exhaust and stuff, because apes and stuff, including humans and groups that regulate that aggression by, you know, roughhousing with each other. In respect, they don't necessarily want to hurt each other, but um, it can be fairly asserted that the more primitive apes do want to do that and stuff, because they their their mind is uh, an engine is more of an engine for degeneration and stuff. For the replacement of, you know proper good working material or personnel with waste and stuff. And aside from the I guess we could go to the moral aspect of it and stuff. There's a lot of differing personal views on the moral evaluation of violence and stuff. Um, so I don't think the personal evaluation suits it. And so I just think in principle it is it's just not good to have a violent psychology and stuff, regardless of what your perspective on morality, ethics, or um, what your perspective in regards to religion is. Um, so it really makes a good case for a not like a visually based morality and stuff, but you know a factual, realistic basis for what is moral and what is not and stuff, regardless of whether that reality was the past or the future and stuff, or whether that reality is what you're really thinking about, you know. And a person with a violent psychology doesn't necessarily spend the time thinking and stuff to make the better decision later. They're always going to be stuck with um, premature ideation and calculation and stuff. So it has to be understood that it a violent psychology is a liability and stuff, and regardless of whether you put it in the light of the law or not, it's a liability. Um, though I don't speak for like things with regards to um, the Department of Defense, or Department of War, as it's now called, and the Department of Justice. Because there's boundaries. I respect those boundaries and stuff. But in general, and like in I would say most areas of life and stuff, it's not good to be like a violent-minded person and stuff. A lot of some people think that that's like a cool thing, and it's kind of suggested and portrayed in mass media and stuff. Um, it's certainly depicted in a lot of mass media, but it's not good. It's really not good. Um, I know there was something else I wanted to say about this topic. Yeah, I would go as far as to hazard to say that a person who is just automatically has a violent psychology, like they just persist through that for the entire day, has a real, you know, not just to have a real problem, but like it's a bad personality trait and stuff. Like there's a time and a place to take action and stuff, and so there's going to be times and places where violence is necessitated and stuff. Um, for many different reasons, but eh, you know it's that can lead to a bad precedent and stuff, and it's also just it's kind of it becomes it's also a permanent thing to create and stuff. Like if that becomes the fact and stuff, that's always going to be the fact and stuff. Like it's just it's always going to be there. And um, life life holds a person accountable and stuff in so many different ways. We can talk about arrows of time all we want and stuff, but it you know the fact is going to be the fact. A person needs to be very honest with themselves, and um, just like they need to be honest with with many people in their lives and stuff. Not that I'm saying to lie. I'm saying that even though that might be connotated there are other options besides lying, and deceptive, malicious behavior and stuff. Um, there may not be 1,000 options or 2,000 options, but there's plenty. And but you know, and when it is, but going back to the more marginal point I'm making, a person has to, you know, if a person's really honest with themselves, you know, that that's pretty good, and they could be honest and real with themselves, and when they are that way, they become something they can trust and stuff, and they're genuine with themselves, and if a person's really doing that and stuff, they're opening up way more possibilities than just doing the violent or the impulsive thing and stuff. So they they create a much better life for themselves. Um, so a person is who's just violent, like some ape, you know, giving into that lower human nature and stuff, the simian brain, the reptilian brain and stuff, the mammalian brain. Like um, they really are not being real with themselves. And yeah, um, so you know, regardless of what the law says, it does not enhance or reduce the value of violence, or not the value, but like the evaluation of violence. Um, and I think if somebody's being real about that evaluation, they have like a realistic basis for it and stuff. Um, and I think any good academic notion of it, um, it would have to be grounded as well. Um, and yeah, so now on the topic, I mean, I talked about like the Department of Defense, Department of War, Department of Justice, and stuff. It still stands. Um, war is inevitable and stuff, and yeah, sometimes you solve out of it, and but it's it sets a very different signal and stuff when a person like when somebody is you know mandated and stuff, compelled to do their due diligence, and there's of enjoying the freedom and safety, etc., of the country. Um, again, like I've said many times, I would never tell somebody something that could get them in trouble. So there's that. Um, but a person with a violent psychology has to ask themselves, is there another way? You know, is there a better idea? And uh, you know, I think our culture is a little bit too, you know, obsessed and focused with you know depictions and experiences, you know, whether they're real or not and stuff, of violence. It's good to diversify your experience, with healthier, more with healthier, better ideas. Um, a violent psychology makes a very sick soul, you know, and so to speak. Because I understand some people, they have reservations about the soul, um, in topics of spirituality. Um, and I understand, my discussion here might be inconvenient to some people are who they rabble rouse, and they get they eh, but those really aren't good people. They're not good people. Um, that type of inciting of uh, you know U.S. residents to put themselves in such trouble like that is uh, is definitely a type of conduct disorder, I think. And it's also uh, it's a big liability, a personality. Um, is that to say that society shouldn't have punishment mechanisms? Of course, and stuff. It should sting, so to speak, to do things that a person should never do, and you know, it should sting that to make decisions that are bad. It sets a very bad precedent when a person can simply do things that were not supposed to happen, or they should not do and stuff, or things that are honestly just hideous. So, um, yeah, I don't, I haven't read really. I'm not like an expert on law and stuff, but I knew that much, and I was willing to share that with you. So there, I've been going on for about 18 minutes now, and I should just cut